Hello and welcome to our podcast on economic indicators. We're going to give you a long list of data points that economists use in order to measure the health of the economy. So whenever you're having those conversations like, hey, how is the economy doing? And people are saying, oh, it's pretty good. No, I actually think it's doing pretty poorly. We're going to talk about what indicators people are actually using in order to inform those opinions. So let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So that question of how is the economy doing tends to come up, amongst dinner parties for adults and things like that. It is an important and a pretty common question. And since the United States economy is the largest or the second largest, kind of depending on which measures you are using, we do have many moving parts going on in our nation. It's not a simple answer to answer how is the economy doing. There's a lot of different ways we can be looking at this. And so there are many possible interpretations as to how the economy is doing. Because while it might be doing well for some people, other people might be saying, but hey, I'm still unemployed. So it doesn't seem to be doing well for them. So we're going to talk through some data points that give us insights into different parts of the economy. And so we'll look at how each of these measures measure different parts of a very large economy. And so the first measure we might look at is what we call gross domestic product, or GDP. And by definition, this is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given year. So this means that we are taking all of the physical goods that are produced in a nation in a year and giving them a value. So every car that is produced, every microwave, every book. But then we're also assigning a value to every service that is produced within a country within a given year. Every dental visit, every orthodontic visit, every teaching moment, those are all given a value. And so at the end of this, we get a number that says this is the GDP of a country. So this means these are all the goods and services that are being produced within a country within a given year and the value associated with all of those. So we can then take the GDP and split it into two different smaller measures. One we call the nominal GDP, and this is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders within a given year, but not adjusted for inflation. This assumes that $1 in 1900 has the same purchasing power, has the same value as that dollar in 2000. So we can look at that nominal GDP and ask ourselves, without adjusting for inflation, how has our creation of new goods and services improved or decreased over a period of time? Or we can look at what we call the real GDP, which I find more useful than the nominal GDP because we can compare more easily different time periods, because here we get the same thing, the value of goods and services produced within a country within a given year, but the value of that dollar is adjusted for inflation and for purchasing power. So we might be able to say, hey, back in 1900, the U.S. was making, let's say, $5 million worth of stuff and services over a year. But now we're making $18 trillion worth of stuff and services. So we can compare that and go, wow, we are making substantially more stuff here 100 years later. And so the real GDP adjusts the values for inflation, which is another measure we'll talk about in a couple slides. And so here we have a graph of the United States' real GDP. And so you can see how much our GDP has improved over the last 50, 60 years, which means as a nation, we are making more stuff and we are providing more valuable services over the course of each year within our borders. And so we have a third data point that is somewhat related to GDP, and we call that the growth rate. This looks at the rate of change of how much we are producing. It's not saying, hey, we made $5 billion worth of stuff and services in a year. The growth rate is going to look at how much more did we produce this year than last year. And so this is oftentimes a very tangible way for us to measure how the economy is growing. We might be making more stuff and services than last year, but we can look at this in terms of a percentage. How much more than last year are we making, or how much less than last year are we making? And so as we look at this growth rate, it's going to help us figure out what part of the business cycle that we are in. So let's take a small digression for a second. This is the business cycle that we tend to use in economics. Nothing can be perfect forever. There's always going to be these ups and downs in business, whether it's your own mom and pop store, a larger corporation like a Target or a Macy's or something larger, or even within a national economy. There are going to be times where the economy is growing and where it is then shrinking and then recovering and expanding again and shrinking again. So we can see the terms that we use here, that anything that's going up, kind of like a roller coaster, we call that recovery or expansion. The economy is growing. It is doing better overall. Then we're going to hit a high point. At some point, we're going to have some sort of apex to our growth because we can only sustain so much growth at any one point. And then we're probably going to take some amount of downsizing, some sort of recession, and it's going to bottom out in what we call the trough or the slump. But then with time, the typical pattern is things get better again. This is the typical business cycle that we're talking about. So when we overlay the GDP growth rate with the business cycle, we can look at how quickly or how slowly or how negatively the U.S. economy has grown over the last 16 years by this graph here. And so one more here from gross domestic product, we can look at it per capita. If we look at all the total goods and services created by a country within a year, we can then take that number and artificially separate that out evenly for every single person who is in the country. So if we had $1 million made within a country within a year, and we had only 100 people in that country, we could give each 100 people an even amount of money. And so we would be able to more easily compare economies of different countries. So if the United States has about $50,000 per person, that's a set number. But if we compare that to another nation like Australia, who might have 60,000 per person, that's a different number than, say, an African nation that might be making about $1,000 per person. And so you can see in this map the distribution where countries have higher or lower per capita amounts. So another large indicator that we can look at to determine how healthy our economy is the unemployment rate. And so the unemployment rate measures the percentage of the nation's labor force that is actively looking for work. So again, there's some things in there that focus in who's actually measured in this. One, they need to be within the nation's labor force. So people around 18 to 65 years old. This isn't going to count children who aren't working. This isn't going to count senior citizens who have retired. Additionally, it's going to count only those people who are actively looking for work. So if somebody has been unemployed for a long time and they just simply give up and stop looking for work, and they try to sustain their life in some other way without work, they're not going to be counted anymore. Additionally, if a family is growing and adding more children to the mix, and one of the spouses who was working chooses to stay home and take care of the children at home, then they are not counted also because they have left the labor force. They're not actively looking for outside gainful employment. An unemployment rate that is healthy for an economy like ours is somewhere between 4 and 6%. But the unemployment rate gives us a decent look at who is and who is not working in our economy. And so here you can see the U.S. unemployment rate from 2007 to about 2017. Right after 2008, during the recession, we had very high unemployment. 10% of our nation was unemployed. A lot of people out of work, yet still looking for work. But over the last 8 years, give or take, we have seen that unemployment rate go down. So more people are finding gainful employment, more people are being employed. They are then taking those paychecks and either saving it or spending it back into the economy. And so our unemployment rate at the time of this chart is about 4.5%, which, like we said on the previous slide, is relatively decent. Another indicator we might look at to answer that question of how is the economy doing is what we call the Consumer Confidence Index, or CCI. And this is a pretty subjective measure. The idea that we are going to just ask people, how do you think the economy is doing? And we're going to take those questions from a large survey body of about 5,000 households and come up with a number. And so this conference board is going to ask 5 questions. How do you think the current business conditions are doing? How do you think they're going to do in the next 6 months for business? How about the current employment conditions? How are they for you, for your employees? How about the employment conditions over the next 6 months? And then how about your entire family income for the next 6 months? Do you think you're going to be doing okay? Do you think you're going to be getting a raise? Do you think you might be getting fired? And so this board will crunch all of these numbers and come up with a final number to be able to say, hey, Americans are relatively confident about the economy, or Americans are relatively nervous about how the economy is going. And so you can see a measure of this from 1977 to February of 2016. And again, you can see the ups and downs of this CCI number. There's going to be times where Americans are very confident about where they think the economy is and what they think their future is going to look like. Additionally, there are times when things aren't so good, and so their consumer confidence goes down. And you can notice that the gray areas are where we have had actual economic recessions, and you can see the parallels. When we have the makings of a recession where the economy is contracting or shrinking or not doing as well, people tend to not be so optimistic. And then as market forces change, as more things loosen up in the economy, more people begin to spend money, maybe some people get a raise, all of a sudden their subjective feelings change and people feel more confident. And then look, the numbers go up. And that parallels the idea of the economy pulling out of a recession and going back into that growth or expansion period. Another indicator we're going to look at is what we call the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. And this is basically a measure of inflation. And inflation is most easily defined as the idea of rising prices. We don't just look at the price of one thing, like a banana or a car, to be able to determine if inflation is happening and at what rate prices are going up. Groups that measure inflation are going to look at what they call the market basket of products. They're going to look at a whole conglomeration of things and ask themselves, are the prices on all of these things generally going up, staying the same, or going down? And then again, they crunch those numbers and they look at it and say, hey, based on all of these products, it seems like we're having an inflation rate, a rising price rate of 1% or 2% or something more dangerous like 20%, something like that. And so inflation aligns with, the things that your grandparents talk about, where they say, yeah, back in my day, we bought our first house for $7,000. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe that. A house today costs $300,000. How could it be possible that you bought your house for $7,000? Well, that's inflation. Okay, everything has gotten more expensive since the 1950s when they bought their first house. Yes, their house cost them $7,000, but they were only being paid, let's say, $10,000 a year total. By contrast, that same home today might cost $300,000, and maybe those grandparents, if they were still working, might be making $80,000. So everything over time has gotten more expensive, and ideally wages have kept up with that. But the idea of inflation is rising prices. The same candy bar that used to cost your grandparents a nickel back in the day now costs us $1.25. Same product, but rising prices. Another indicator we're going to look at to determine how healthy our economy is the idea of purchasing power. And so this is related to inflation. We're going to be looking at just the number of goods and services that can be purchased with a unit of currency. So $1 today is still $1 from 1950. Like, it's still a piece of paper. It is worth 100 cents. But the question becomes, what can you buy for that dollar? What could we buy now for one even dollar? Maybe a bottle of Coke or something like that. Well, back in the day, $1 used to buy you 2 bottles of Coke or 4 bottles of Coke, something like that. So your purchasing power has actually gone down. And so this does relate to inflation, because as prices of goods go up and your wages do or do not grow at a similar rate, purchasing power may go down. And so we do see that happening here in the United States economy, that our purchasing power over the time period from about 1900 on has actually gone down. Now, there have been improvements over time, but there has been a long, steady decline. So that lets us know that overall, inflation is outpacing wage growth. Prices of things are going up, but people who are buying those things, their wages are not keeping up with inflation. So it's harder and harder to buy certain goods. Another thing we can look at to determine the health of the economy is what we call the discount rate. And this is going to be kind of abstract for us. So basically the Federal Reserve Bank, like the federal level banking institution, charges a rate to loan money to other banks. Those banks then turn around and loan money to people like us to buy a house, to buy a car, to buy a boat. But the original rate is called the discount rate. And so we can look at that number and ask ourselves, how cheap or expensive is it to borrow money? Because if the Fed says that the discount rate is 1%, meaning that banks are going to have to pay them back for loans at 1% interest, those banks that we borrow from are going to charge more than 1% interest because they need to make money to then pass on the interest to the higher ups. If the discount rate is, say, 1%, and we go to First Bank and get a loan for a car, they're going to charge us maybe 5%. But if the Fed raises the discount rate to 2%, maybe First Bank charges us 7% interest in order to get a car loan. Excessively high discount rate is going to be a challenge for us because people aren't going to want to borrow money. And if people aren't borrowing money, they're probably not spending it. They're not buying the car or the boat or the college degree. Therefore, the economy is going to struggle a little bit. At the same time, if the discount rate goes to near zero, where it's basically free to borrow money, that could be a challenge too, because then everybody's going to say, hey, I need to borrow this for a house and for a car and for a boat and whatever. If people don't pay that back because they've basically been given free money from a bank, that could be a problem as well. And so here you can see the ups and downs of the discount rate for the United States. We had very high interest rates in the 1980s, so it was very expensive to borrow money. So one would assume that not a lot of people were going to borrow money because if you borrowed $100, you might have to pay back $130 versus $105. But over time, that discount rate has gone down significantly. And as we were at the height of the recession in 2008, you can see that the rate was nearing zero. And again, the idea was, hey, if we can make the discount rate zero, we can get more people to borrow money for a car, a boat, or a ski-doo or whatever, and then they might go out and spend that, and that helps the economy. Another measure we can look at is what we call the poverty rate. And so this is the percentage of people in America who live in households with income below the official poverty line. And so that's a pretty abstract thing, but basically we say that's insufficient income to support a family. And so the dollar amount of what makes the poverty rate can go up and go down. By definition, if a family of one person or two people or two parents and a kid are making less than a certain given amount, that puts them under the poverty line. So that puts them in poverty. And so we express this as a percent, the percent of Americans who are in poverty. And so again, as we look at some numbers, you can see kind of the ups and downs of the poverty rate, and you can see the shaded areas which were times of recession. And so you can see the numbers of people in millions who were in poverty at the top, but then you can also look at a more comparable rate down at the bottom as a percentage. So the current is about 14, maybe 15% of Americans fall below this rate of poverty. Another indicator we can look at is the number of new housing starts. And this is the number of new homes being built at any given time. So if we wanted to look at how healthy the economy is in terms of new places for people to live, we would look at housing starts. Are builders building more homes? Why would they be doing this? Well, because they think people have enough money in their pocket or can get a good enough loan to buy these houses eventually. And so builders are going to respond to demand and start building more houses. And the more houses we have going on, that's a lot of people in the construction industry who are being employed. And so that's another indicator that the economy is doing relatively well because more homes are being built. And here we have a graph of that right before the recession of 2008, we were starting a lot of new houses every month. Numbers were very, very high. We were making millions of homes a year. But then as the recession hit in 2008 and things went downhill pretty quickly, fewer construction companies started making fewer homes. Another indicator we might look at is what we call the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So the Dow, basically the stock market. So this is going to be a measurement of how well the stocks of 30 large US companies are doing. This is not every stock that exists in the stock market. This is kind of a cross-section of 30 companies. Things like Boeing, 3M, or Caterpillar. They're going to look at some big companies and say, hey, how are these 30 doing? Are they increasing their stock price or are they decreasing their stock price? The Dow Jones average is going up. That's letting us know that at least these 30 companies, which are probably indicative of the stock market overall, that they're probably doing pretty well. So that aspect of our economy is doing well also. So you can see how the Dow Jones has generally done from 2000 all the way up to about 2015. There has been a relatively healthy yet exponential growth in how well the Dow Jones stocks have been doing. You can see some downturns in around 2004, large one in 2008. But every time so far, it has recovered. It has gone up and up and up after that. For those people who own stock, it seems like this is a good indicator as to how well the economy is doing for them or for people with stock. Our last indicator that we want to look at is the idea of income inequality. And so this is defined as the gap between who is called rich and who is called poor. We have to look at the overall wealth being accumulated in the nation and ask ourselves, who holds that wealth? Is it 5 people holding 50% of the wealth in the nation? Or do we have a more even distribution like communism might provide? Or do we have a more steady and even growth that somebody could be classified as in poverty, but could rationally and reasonably accumulate more wealth and move to the middle class or move all the way to what's considered rich? So in sum, out of all of these data points, there are many different aspects of our economy. And economists are going to look at all of these to make a general determination of how healthy the economy is. Because we might be able to say, hey, inflation is kind of under control. Unemployment is pretty low. That's good. That's great. But you know what? Purchasing power isn't all that great. People are still struggling. Or the income inequality gap is growing for some reason. So we have some good points and some bad points, and then we're able to draw a conclusion at the end to say, yes, overall, the economy is, somewhat healthy, very healthy, extremely healthy, or whatever. And so each indicator does reveal parts of the largest economy. We have so many things going on that looking at any one of these in isolation and then saying, well, if the Dow Jones is doing well, then everything is doing well. That might not be really responsible. We have to look at a bunch of things. We have to look at the causes and the effects of the numbers of each of these, and then kind of put them all together to generate a final answer. Additionally, we have to keep in mind those 5 social goals that we've talked about throughout the course: efficiency, innovation, equality, security, etc. And what is good or bad by these indicators might correlate to which social goals and therefore political goals that you might desire to see in the world. So if you personally value an economy that is a little bit more stable, then having great income inequality gaps might make you nervous. If you are more concerned about growth and innovation, then maybe the Dow Jones doing well might be your most favorite indicator in the world. And so we have to compile all of those pieces of information, all of those social goals, and able to draw a more accurate conclusion about where we are as an economy. I think that's it for now. A lot of stuff going on in this podcast. Please be sure to bring in those questions and concerns you have. We'll make sure that we understand each of these indicators a little bit more in class. We'll go from there and we will move forward. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you soon.